大家好，欢迎收看今天的全球瞭望，我是郭崇伦。最近全世界各国都担心少子化，这是不是一个国家安全危机？我们今天在现场特别邀请到香港科技大学人文社会科学院的副院长贝斯图先生，跟我们来做访谈。Stuart, thank you to be on our show.
Hello.
First, I'd like to begin with what kind of fertility rate should a country have? I mean, there's different way to measure this. Some people are worried that because there's less and less children that we cannot afford the pension scale that is happening now. Some people are saying that if the population is decreasing in such a speed, in the future, there's not going to be any people left. And some people are even worried that our country is getting into an aging population instead of there's no new young people to supplant that. So how do we measure, and I understand that fertility rate is only part of the whole equation, but how do we should see that?
I would say that there's no such thing as an ideal fertility rate. There's no such thing as an optimum fertility rate in itself. You know? If you really want the population to grow very fast, then of course you need a very high fertility rate. If, on the other hand, you, for whatever reason, want the population to shrink, you need a very low fertility rate. But all of that is neutral unless you attach it to something else. Right? If you're very worried about aging, then of course you want to increase the fertility rate. But then there's many other ways to offset the implications or the consequences of population aging. I mean, for what it's worth, I would say that we talk about replacement rate, so fertility of around 2 as being an ideal, but it doesn't need to be. There's no reason why fertility of around 2 should be the optimum rate. There's no reason why the population of Taiwan or any country today should be what we maintain into the future. I mean, I suppose I would say that as with everything in life, you want to avoid the extremes. Right? If you have fertility which is very, very high, you have a very rapid population growth which can lead to certain other problems that we can all imagine. Right? But at the same time, if you have extremely low population, a very low fertility rate of say less than 1 or something like that, then that also leads to very rapid change, demographic change. So I think as long as you kind of avoid those 2 extremes, and Taiwan is pretty close to one of the extremes then it's probably going to be okay, as long as you can work with the institutions which the fertility rate is going to impact upon.
In your speech on Sunday, you mentioned that according to one of the estimates, Taiwan is in March this year is probably the lowest fertility rate in the world. It's 1.218. Compared with if you want to maintain your population, it should be 2.1. But you suggest that maybe Taiwan don't need such a big population, like 23 million, like it is right now. Maybe Taiwan can reduce to like 20 million. That is really a new concept for us. We always thought that we should maintain the population like we have right now, instead of having a fewer population that can be a more quality a bunch of people. Would you elaborate on your thinking on this?
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing is that there's not many countries that have actually seen population decline, so natural population decline. So it's very difficult for us to say with kind of precision what the implications of this are, socially, economically, politically, because we don't have much experience to draw upon. But I think that you would say that why does the population of Taiwan need to be 23 million forever? It's not a magic number. It doesn't really mean anything in and of itself. It's only been 23 million by definition for a year. 10 years ago it was different. 5 years ago it was different. 20 years ago it was different. If you look over human history, population went up and then it looks like it will come back down again. So I'm not really sure where we get this obsession of the number that it should be. You know, I would say that if you could choose between 23 million people today, or in the future we have 20 million people, and that population is older, which it will be, but also this population is more educated, is healthier, is perhaps able to save more, it has more flexible ideas and more flexible approaches to work, can retrain, can reskill. We can learn the lessons from the past about social security and welfare and pensions. Then actually maybe that smaller, healthier, better qualified, better skilled, more productive population could be, and in fact probably should be, more efficient and more effective population than a population of 3 or 5 million more.
There's a general trend here in Asian Pacific countries, like this is not happening not only happening in Taiwan, but also in South Korea, in Japan, in Singapore. Is there any example that other countries have done their policy is more to what you say would be a better approach to this issue?
I think I would say that, again, it just depends on how you approach the issue.
Right. You said it in your talk that you do not agree with using a demographic solution to a demographic problem. What do you mean by that?
So, traditionally, the way we think about it is that aging and population decline is bad.
Right.
And that is predominantly caused by low fertility. So if we fix low fertility, then we can fix aging, or we can fix it through migration as well, through immigration. Now the first problem there is, first we have to define what aging means as a problem, or population decline means as a problem. Just because the number of people aged 65 and above doesn't mean anything in and of itself. If it's only related to the pension system or to the social security system and how that can be maintained. It's also
we are assuming that the people over 65, they are losing all their productivity.
Correct.
They will need their pension. They will be paying or supporting by a younger generation.
Yeah.
That's the assumption.
That's
right?
the assumption, but that assumption is firstly incorrect. And it's based upon such an outdated idea. I mean, you wouldn't believe the first. I've been looking in some kind of historical documents. I know this might sound a bit unusual to talk about this, but the first time I can see the age of 65 as being given as a justification for this is as a cutoff or a boundary to old age was in 1825. And we're using the same boundary to old age as we were using nearly 200 years ago.
Right,
and of course, over 200 years, we've as human beings, we've changed enormously. You know, we've become taller and healthier and stronger and more educated, and we live for much longer, and we survive to 65, and yet we are still basing all of our calculations around 65 as this kind of golden number. So the first thing we have to do is to better diagnose what the problem is, okay? And then we think about, well, but it's still the case that low fertility is the primary cause of population aging and certainly a population decline. Now, different governments have tried to fix this in a direct way by subsidies and baby bonuses and things like that, and it's not really worked. And I think the reason for this is that we see low fertility as the problem, but I would argue that this very, very low fertility is rather the consequence of other problems in society. And it's not that people don't want to have children anymore, because they do. So why is it that people say they want to get married, they want to have 2 children, maybe more than 2 children, but when actually they have to make these decisions about whether to have children, they just don't do that. It becomes very difficult. And so unless we explore these other upstream factors in terms of the reasons why people's fertility is low, then it's never going to change.
some countries start to think of bringing immigrants as part of the solutions. Mm-hmm. This is not only increasing the number of the population, but also immigrants will sometimes will have more higher fertility rate than the rest of the population. But this become a very sensitive political issues. How do you see bringing immigrants as a solution for the low fertility rate?
So immigration has a key role to play in certain aspects of, let's say, the labour market, okay, without a doubt.
Right.
That there'll be many jobs that people either don't want to do or can't do, or there's not enough people to meet the requirements, to meet the needs. And in the short term, the simplest solution to that will always be immigration. And we can see in the future there will inevitably be an increase in the number of people required to work in elderly care, right, and chronic long-term care. And so, of course, the simplest solution for that is through immigration. In the medium and long term, maybe we could say, well, actually, we can make it a job that people want to do. So we invest in training and vocation, we give it a dignity, we make care a proper job, and then we need to rely on migration less. Similarly, other high-skilled jobs in the labour market, maybe we just need, or in the medical sector, we need particular people to come in from abroad. And I think that very few people would argue with that interpretation of immigration for economic reasons.
Right.
But the idea that you would, in order to keep the population 23 million, does that mean that every year we've got to bring in 1 million migrants, and then next year we've got to bring in 3 million migrants, and the year after that we've got to bring in 5 million migrants, and the year after that to me doesn't make any sense, because that's just bringing in, that's just migration for its own sake, that's immigration for its own sake. There's no need to keep the population size and structure exactly the way it is at the moment. And so to use immigration as a tool to fulfill that doesn't really make any sense. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, that why does the population need to be 23 million? There's no need for it.
Right.
Now, that's, again, whether or not, in terms of cultural acceptance and things, I would strongly argue that if migrants come to a country, they're making a contribution to a country, and then they should be supported and made to feel part of this community that they are that they're making a contribution to. But that is very different to being kind of pro-immigration or anti-immigration. You know, immigration in and of itself doesn't solve the problem of, doesn't solve the demographic problem.
I would like you to comment on the German policy of bringing in immigrations in the past few years. I mean, Germany have been known for have a very low fertility rate for a long time in Europe. And there's an argument by Chancellor Merkel saying that because Germany had done this after the World War II, a lot of Turks have been remaining in Germany, that had really helped German economy, and then now it's a time to bring in another wave of immigrants to be integrated in the German society. But we are seeing such a strong reaction coming from the society that that is, some people are saying that causing Chancellor Merkel's job these days. That what you have just described is not referring to a particular policy, but would you care to comment on what Germany have been doing these days?
So when we look at Germany and actually the recent history of European immigration over the last years, I think we have to be very mindful of the context. That many people have talked about so Germany taking in many refugees over the years, right, as being a way to offset population aging and offset the low fertility rate. Now, maybe somebody thinks this, but I would say that the reason why Germany took in so many refugees is because it was felt to be the right thing to do. That these were people who were fleeing persecution and war in other parts of the world, and Germany, in my view, did the right thing in accepting them. Now, whether or not it had the right follow-up policies for supporting them and for integration and for education and so on, and for a long-term plan, that's a different issue, right? But then also, of course, you've got to remember that Germany is part of the European Union, and there is still freedom of movement in the European Union. So migration is is just a day-to-day reality of life in different parts of the European Union. Now, whether or not all countries of the European Union have the right policies about integration and about multiculturalism and engagement in the labour market, that again is another question. And of course, there's a lot of improvements that can be made. But I guess it goes back to the principle would be the same for Germany as it would be for anywhere else, that a demographic solution to a demographic problem is going to be problematic. Okay, that instead of saying yes, of course we can offset population aging, we can offset population decline, we can increase the fertility rate a bit by through the means of immigration. But then you would say, but what's the value of that? Right? Why would we be doing that? Is it just to keep the fertility rate at an arbitrary level, to keep the population total at an arbitrary level, to keep the age distribution at an arbitrary level? It's actually going to be more effective to more better define what the problem is and approach that from an institutional perspective rather than from a demographic perspective.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. 我们等一下回来继续的跟贝斯图教授来谈现在目前的人口政策。我们等一下回来继续谈。